September 3rd, 1942. The morning haze over the RAF forward strip in Egypt clung like a thin veil of dust, softening the jagged edges of the sandbag revetments and the skeletal remains of wrecked hurricanes pushed to the far end of the field. The sun was barely up, but heat was already radiating off the desert floor, wrapping itself around every man like a suffocating blanket. Corporal Tom Redford, a 26-year-old RAF fitter from Leicestershire, wiped the grit from his eyelids as he approached the maintenance bays, boots crunching on the hardpan earth. He had slept only 3 hours, and even that had been broken by the distant thump of German Stuka raids hammering British supply lines throughout the night. Nobody on the strip had slept well in weeks. The Luftwaffe had been hunting them relentlessly, waiting for the exact moment the fighters ran low on fuel or ammunition. And today, Tom knew they were running low on everything. The desert wind carried the smell of aviation fuel, hot metal, and the faint acidic sting of battery acid, a strange cocktail that had become as familiar to him as the smell of home. He stepped past the skeleton of a hurricane with its wings removed, its fuselage propped up on oil drums like some wounded desert animal. The ground crew had nicknamed it Old Lucky, because it had somehow survived 3 forced landings and 2 belly skids. Now it served as a donor, stripped daily for parts that no supply convoy could deliver on time. Tom's squadron, number 274, had been flying continuous sorties against German armoured spearheads pushing toward the Nile Delta. Every pilot was exhausted. Every machine stretched far beyond its limits, and every man on the ground felt the drumbeat of approaching disaster. What tipped today from bad to desperate was an event that happened only minutes after Tom reached the dispersal area. A young runner, barely 19, sprinted across the sand, shouting that the spotters had just radioed. A lone Ju-87 Stuka was heading directly toward the airstrip, low over the dunes, likely hunting for fuel dumps or the row of hurricanes parked in the open. One bomb from that German dive bomber could cripple the entire forward detachment. Tom stopped dead. The spotters said the nearest Hawker fighter capable of taking off in time was 2 miles away in a separate revetment, still missing a proper bomb load that should have been delivered days ago. The thin stock of 40 Pulsar GP bombs had been used the previous night. The squadron had ammo for strafing, but nothing explosive to counter the armoured underside of a Stuka. The pilots could launch, yes, but without ordnance, all they could do was chase the enemy and pray. Tom knew what that meant. The Germans would simply circle back and hammer them again. Something inside him snapped. Not panic, not fear, but a sharp, brutal clarity. He turned toward the fuel depot area, eyes landing on the battered, half-empty 44-gallon fuel drums stacked against a corrugated shed. They were thick-skinned, steel, dented from travel across half of Africa. One drum in particular lay split at the seam from being dropped off a transport truck, its lid caved inward like a crushed tin can. Most men saw scrap. Tom saw something else. A weight. A shape. A container. Something aerodynamic enough for a fighter, something that could be filled with something. He sprinted toward the drum pile, heart pounding. He grabbed the broken unit and heaved it upright. The metal scraped against the sand with a screech. Inside, the faint slosh of leftover fuel licked the sides. Not much, just enough to wet the metal. Tom's mind raced. He'd done field improvisations before, jury-rigged exhaust manifolds, patched bullet holes with melted-down tins, built makeshift gun mounts from scaffold bars. But never this. Never something that could kill him instantly if he misjudged the weight or the balance or the fuse. But the Stuka was coming. He could already feel the faint tremor of distant engines vibrating through the sand. He shouted for assistance. 2 armourers, both covered in grease and sweat, ran over. When he told them what he wanted to do, one cursed under his breath, the other laughed in disbelief, but neither walked away. That was how it was in the desert. Mad ideas weren't dismissed. They were tested, because sometimes madness saved lives. Tom grabbed a crowbar and slammed it down on the drum's dented mouth. The lid snapped open with a metallic groan. The smell of petrol filled the air. He tipped the drum, letting most of it drain into a catchpan until only a thin, shimmering film remained at the bottom. Enough to ignite, but not explode prematurely. He needed the drum to survive 1 drop, maybe 2 seconds, before the fire swallowed it whole. He grabbed a box of gelignite charges the sappers had abandoned the week before and shoved them inside the drum, packing them tightly with cloth strips, wiring the whole mess to a shortened fuse. The other fitter held the drum steady, hands trembling. Tom worked fast, hands moving by instinct more than thought. Sweat ran down his face, dripping into his eyes, but he didn't stop. The vibrations in the sand were stronger now, louder, closer. The scream of a Junkers Jumo engine was unmistakable. A Stuka. The desert air tightened, the horizon rippled with heat waves, and then, far beyond the southern dunes, a dark speck appeared, growing larger with terrifying speed. Men on the airstrip shouted warnings. A pilot started sprinting for his Hurricane. Tom knew the fighters' guns would be nearly useless against a diving Stuka at full attack angle. They needed something heavier, something that could knock it out of the sky in one brutal strike. He barked at the others to help him lift the drum. Together they rolled it toward the nearest Hurricane, a Mark IIB with patched wings and a nose cone that rattled during idle throttle. Not a bomber, not built for strange payloads, but Tom had worked on that particular Hurricane more than any other. He knew its belly fittings intimately. He had removed the standard bomb rack a month ago to replace it with a makeshift auxiliary fuel cradle during an emergency operation. The bolt holes were still there. He grabbed a bracket from the scrap pile, a leftover piece from a destroyed bomb rack, and held it against the underbelly. The alignment was close enough. Not perfect, but close enough for the desert. He shouted instructions. Tools flew into hands. Spanners turned. Bolts screeched through warped metal. The drum was wrestled into place, dangling awkwardly but securely. It looked insane. It looked hopeless. It looked like something a desperate man would try when the world was ending. But it held. The pilot, Flight Sergeant Alan Hawks Hawking, skidded to a stop beside the aircraft, staring in disbelief. His eyes flicked from Tom to the drum to the sky. He didn't ask questions. There was no time. "Will it drop clean?" Hawks demanded. Tom didn't lie. Only one way to find out. The engine roared to life, coughing clouds of dust. The Hurricane jolted forward. Tom leapt back as the wheels churned through the sand, the drum swaying slightly under the fuselage. Hawks accelerated toward the makeshift runway, the Stuka now descending fast, its siren, the infamous Jericho trumpet, beginning its banshee scream. Men instinctively ducked. The Stuka levelled out for a strafing pass, machine guns flickering in the sunlight. Tom ran forward a few steps, watching, breathing hard, his hands trembling with the residue of adrenaline. The Hurricane clawed into the air, its engine strained, the balance uneven from the improvised load, but it climbed. Just enough. The Stuka banked right, lining up again, eager to finish the job. Hawks pushed his Hurricane to its limit, closing the gap between them. Tom watched, willing the pilot to hold steady, to trust the insane contraption strapped beneath him. At barely 300 feet separation, Hawks flicked the release lever. The drum dropped. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The drum fell awkwardly, wobbling, twisting end over end like a misshapen metal coffin tumbling through the air. The Stuka pilot saw it too late. He jerked the stick. Not enough. The drum struck just ahead of the canopy frame. The impact sending a violent shockwave through the Stuka's nose. The gelignite ignited the petrol film instantly. A blossom of fire erupted mid-air. The Stuka lurched, its wings sheared by the blast. The screaming siren cut off mid-howl. The aircraft disintegrated into a downward spiral of flames and debris, crashing into the dunes in a cascade of smoke. The entire airstrip froze. Tom felt his knees soften. The pilot circled back, wobbling slightly from turbulence and imbalance. As the Hurricane descended and rolled to a stop, Hawks climbed out, face white with disbelief. "You mad, brilliant, absolute bastard!" he gasped, grabbing Tom's shoulder. Tom didn't speak. He just stared at the dunes, at the black plume rising, at the impossible fact that a fuel drum, something he'd kicked around earlier that morning, had just killed a German dive bomber in less than 2 minutes. What he didn't know yet was that this insanity would only be the beginning. Within hours, they would try it again, and the next day, and the next, and the war would bend, just slightly, around the desperate ingenuity of men who refused to surrender to shortages, fear, or fate itself. The heat reached its fierce midday peak, pressing down on the strip like an invisible hand as the smoke from the downed Stuka still curled in a lonely black column far beyond the dunes. Men had gathered around the wreckage of Tom's makeshift bomb pod, still clinging to the Hurricane's underside until Hawks taxied back. They touched it with disbelief, then with laughter, then with a kind of reverence. The word drum bomb passed through the unit like wildfire. Someone joked that Tom had just invented the world's ugliest air-to-air weapon. Someone else said he'd probably get court-martialed for tampering with ordnance. But the pilots who crowded around the fitter had no doubts. He had saved the entire forward detachment. Tom barely had time to catch his breath before the squadron commander, squadron leader Markham, arrived in a battered truck, sand blasting against its undercarriage. Markham jumped out, his khaki shirt drenched in sweat, a map rolled under his arm. He looked at the ruined Stuka, then at Tom, then at Hawks, who stood beside the Hurricane still trembling from the adrenaline crash. "Do it again," Markham said simply. Tom blinked. "Sir, that wasn't luck," Markham replied. "That was necessity. And the Luftwaffe will be back, today, tonight, tomorrow at dawn, and we won't have bombs for days yet. So if you found a way to swat a Stuka out of the sky with rubbish," he pointed at the dented, blackened drum, "then by God, make more rubbish." And just like that, Tom became the most important man on the strip. He didn't feel like it. His hands still shook. His heartbeat still thumped in his ears. But he didn't hesitate. The ground crew was already gathering spare drums, dismantling damaged racks, and dragging every broken bracket from the boneyard behind the mechanic hut. The air shimmered with heat as men ran back and forth, galvanized by the impossible success of a single mad idea. Tom picked up a second drum. This one wasn't split, so he took a hammer to its rim, warping it just enough to pry open a seam and drain the remaining fuel. While the others held it steady, he packed it the same way as before: gelignite, cloth buffers, a shortened fuse wired to an improvised contact patch. But as he worked, he noticed something. The drum balanced slightly differently. The ribs along its side had a deeper indentation on one half than the other. That meant drag. Uneven fall. A potential tumble pattern. He couldn't let that happen. The first drum had tumbled only because of the violence of the drop. This one needed to tumble deliberately, because a tumbling bomb didn't simply fall. It punched downward unpredictably. Against a diving aircraft, that unpredictability was lethal. He grabbed a wrench and pressed into the side, bending a faint ridge outward, just a centimetre, maybe a little more. Enough to catch the wind, enough to make it rotate. One of the younger mechanics watched him intently. "What's that for?" "Stability," Tom murmured. "Or instability, depending how you look at it." "You sure it'll work?" "No," Tom answered truthfully, "but the Stuka pilot won't be sure either." He finished the wiring and they hauled the drum toward a different Hurricane. This one flown by Sergeant Colin Minty Morris, a quiet Welshman with an easy smile and nerves made of iron. Minty inspected the drum, tapped its side with his knuckle, and said, "If this bloody thing blows me up, I'm haunting you forever." Tom smirked. "Get in line." But the day wasn't done testing him yet. Just as they were bolting the drum to the underside, a distant shape began forming in the sky. Not a speck this time, but 3 specks. 3 aircraft flying in loose formation, descending over the dunes with the telltale hum of German engines. Men on the strip shouted warnings. The pilots scrambled. Tom felt his throat tighten. 3 Stukas. 1 had been bad enough. 3 could wipe out the entire squadron's remaining fighters, fuel reserves, and repair stock in minutes. Minty clambered into his cockpit. "Tell me it's ready!" Tom reached under the fuselage, gave the drum a hard shove, testing the bolts. They held. "Ready?" Minty throttled up. The Hurricane lurched forward, kicking sand behind it as it built speed. Tom stepped back, nearly stumbling as the slipstream whipped his clothes. He watched Minty's aircraft lift into the hot desert air, just as the Stukas broke formation, one circling wide, while two angled into attack dives. Their sirens wailed, a metallic scream that made every man wince. Minty climbed straight toward them. The drums of Tom's heart hammered against his ribs. He felt the sun beat on his neck, the grit blowing into his eyes, but he didn't move. He stood rooted in place as the three dark crosses on wings grew larger and larger above the runway. Minty pulled a hard right, slipping beneath one Stuka, just as its cannons ripped the sand where the Hurricane had been seconds before. The second Stuka tried to line up behind him, but misjudged the drum's drag on Minty's climb pattern. The Hurricane twisted unexpectedly, catching an updraft, surprising even Minty. The Stuka pilot corrected too late. Minty levelled out, then he dropped the drum. This time Tom saw everything: the release, the wobble, the sudden spin as the altered ridge bit into the air and sent the drum spiralling downward like a monstrous steel boomerang. The nearest Stuka, the one that had overshot Minty by a hair, tried to pull up into a widening arc. The drum intersected that arc. It slammed into the left wing root with a shuddering blast that tore the wing clean off. The Stuka snapped sideways, then inverted, then plunged nose first into the sand in a plume of dust and fire. The explosion echoed across the strip, sending a wave of hot air rolling over the ground crew. Someone shouted in disbelief. Someone else exhaled with a trembling laugh, but there were still two Stukas in the sky. Minty pulled another evasive climb, but without his improvised bomb, he had nothing left but machine guns. The second Stuka opened fire, its cannon shells stitching the air dangerously close to his tail. Minty veered into a shallow dive. The Stuka followed. The third stayed high, watching, circling, waiting for its partner to force Minty low enough to kill him. Tom felt his stomach twist. He turned to Markham. "We need another drum." Markham stared at him. "We don't have time." "We don't need time," Tom insisted. "Just a single drum. We can strap it to the Blenheim's belly rails. That Blenheim hasn't flown in." "It just needs to climb," Tom said. "Let me make it climb." Markham hesitated only a second, then waved his arm. "Do it." Dusk settled over the strip in slow, heavy layers, the sky bleeding from blistering gold into the bruised purple of oncoming night. The desert wind, which had howled all afternoon, finally softened into a low whisper that carried the smell of burnt aviation fuel and the chemical tang of explosives. A silence hung over the airfield, tense, brittle. The kind of silence that didn't feel like peace, but like a held breath. The men were restless, glancing at the darkening horizon, knowing exactly what the night would bring. Stukas were the daylight predators. But once darkness took the dunes, the Heinkels came. Tom moved through the tool racks and scrap piles with urgency, but no panic. Panic wasted time, and time now was everything. 3 drums had been used. One on the Stuka that Hawks brought down, one on Minty's engagement, one dropped by the Blenheim. Each had worked, but each had been a different kind of miracle, flawed, improvised, impossible to replicate reliably. Tonight, they would need reliability. The Heinkel He-111 wasn't a nimble dive bomber. It was a medium bomber, with twice the wingspan of a Stuka, and the capacity to carry enough bombs to turn the whole airstrip into a flaming cemetery. If even one got through, the squadron's forward detachment would cease to exist. Tom studied the remaining drums, touching their battered surfaces, lifting them with a practiced gesture to feel the weight distribution, looking at the ribs, the weld seams, the curvature at each end. To knock a Heinkel out of the sky, they couldn't rely on direct hits. A direct hit was a gift from the universe. They needed something more dependable, more controlled. He found it in the shadows behind a stack of crates, a drum that hadn't been standard issue. This one was reinforced at the centre with a thick internal brace, possibly meant for long-distance transport. It was heavier by several kilos, thicker, less likely to rupture on impact. And at its core, it had a cavity large enough to hold not one but two charges. Tom called the men over. He ran them through the plan, packed the drum not with one gelignite cluster, but with twin charges separated by a narrow insulating layer. The first charge, on impact, would rupture the drum, scattering flaming debris. The second, triggered milliseconds later, would produce a directional blast strong enough to shear a tailplane or break a wing spar. He described it quickly, almost clinically, even though he knew none of this had been tested. The idea wasn't to create a bomb, it was to create a mid-air fragmentation cloud, a rolling wall of shrapnel and fire. Against a Heinkel, that was the only way to guarantee damage. The men didn't question him. They were past doubt. Together they pried the drum open with crowbars, their silhouettes moving in the deepening twilight. They drained it partially, letting the fumes drift off into the wind. Tom worked by feel in the dim light, wiring the twin charges carefully, testing the insulation, reinforcing the internal brace with strips of metal torn from a wrecked engine cowling. He stopped only once, when he realized his fingers were trembling again, not from fear this time, but from the realization of what he was doing. He was turning a fuel drum into a thunderclap. A man who a week earlier had been mending cracked coolant lines was now weaponizing rubbish to hold off one of the most feared bomber units of the war. When he finished, the drum looked like nothing that belonged on an aircraft or on Earth. It was crude, ugly, asymmetrical, but stable, predictable. It would fall nose first if dropped at speed. It would break open in 2 stages. It would, if the gods of war were kind, blow a Heinkel out of the night sky. "Mount it," Tom said. They took it to the Hurricane that Hawks had flown earlier, the one whose patched wings had already survived the impossible. The undercarriage was cleaned of dust, the hardpoints reinforced with braces scavenged from the remains of old Lucky. Hawks walked around the aircraft slowly, taking in the sight of the monstrosity hanging beneath it. "Looks heavier," Hawks muttered. "It is," Tom replied. "You'll feel sluggish on climb." "Understatement of the year." Hawks touched the drum. "Will it drop clean?" Tom didn't answer right away. The night wind shifted, carrying with it a distant vibration, a deep, low hum that didn't belong to anything British, a sound that made the hair on the back of every neck rise. Hawks turned toward the horizon. The Heinkels were coming. Their engines droned like a storm behind the dunes, the heavy synchronized beat of twin-engine bombers closing in from altitude. Spotters shouted warnings. Men grabbed rifles, not to fight, but to brace themselves for impact. The first Heinkel flew overhead moments later, a massive silhouette blotting out the stars, its bomb bay doors beginning to open. Hawks scrambled into the cockpit. Tom tapped the fuselage twice, his silent good luck ritual, and backed away as the Hurricane's engine roared to life. The ground shook under the vibration. The prop wash blasted sand into the air as Hawks taxied forward, fighting against the drum's weight. The climb would be harder. The turning radius wider, the margin of error smaller than ever. The Heinkels began their run. Bombs dropped, dark shapes falling silently until they struck the ground with thunderous bursts that shook the earth and sent geysers of sand rocketing into the air. 2 landed frighteningly close to the fuel depot, lighting the night in blinding orange flames. Tom ducked instinctively, shielding his face from the heat wave. The strip was becoming a death zone, but Hawks was airborne. The Hurricane climbed, slowly, painfully, its nose lifting with visible effort. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't quick, but it was climbing. The Heinkels were making another pass, and Hawks angled his ascent to intercept the third bomber in the formation, the one that hung slightly back, possibly lagging from a mechanical issue. A perfect target. Tom ran to higher ground to watch. He could feel his pulse in his jaw, in his fingertips, in the back of his skull. The drum, his creation, hung beneath Hawks like a steel heart waiting to burst. The Heinkel approached, grey belly gleaming in the moonlight. Hawks steadied his aircraft. The Hurricane shuddered from turbulence. The drum's bolts groaned under the strain. Hawks closed the distance. Tom whispered, "Now!" The drum fell. It didn't tumble. It didn't wobble. It pointed straight down, weighted perfectly by the internal brace. It fell like a spear thrown by a god. The Heinkel's lower fuselage flashed silver for an instant as the drum struck it dead center, right between the bomb bay doors. The first charge detonated. The blast peeled open the belly like ripped cloth, scattering flaming fragments into the internal compartments. But the real explosion came a fraction of a second later, when the second charge fired. A roar of white-orange light erupted upward into the Heinkel's wing roots and fuel lines. The bomber staggered mid-air, its left engine bursting into flame, the right engine coughing black smoke. The aircraft buckled. Its tail sagged. Its nose dipped. The Heinkel began a slow, unstoppable spiral, its wings burning, its frame cracking apart, until it slammed into the desert in a colossal fireball that rolled across the dunes like a wave of molten gold. The other Heinkels broke formation instantly, abandoning their attack. They turned into the night, engines wailing as they fled into darkness. The airstrip erupted in shouts. Tom's legs weakened. Men clapped him on the back, shouted his name, embraced him with the desperate, delirious joy of men who had survived something they shouldn't have. Hawks brought the Hurricane down with difficulty, its frame rattling from stress. When he climbed out, he staggered toward Tom, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "You're not a fitter," Hawks said hoarsely. "You're a bloody magician." Tom shook his head. "Just a man with too much scrap metal." But he knew the truth. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He had become part of the war in a way he never intended, not by holding a rifle or flying a fighter, but by creating weapons in the shadows with his own hands. Ingenious, improvised, terrifying. Word spread within hours. Other detachments sent runners asking for diagrams. Command wanted reports. Pilots wanted the Redford drums, as they called them now. But Tom didn't think about any of that. He walked to the edge of the dunes, staring at the glow of the burning Heinkel. The night wind whipped his hair. His hands, still reeking of fuel and gelignite, trembled gently at his sides. He had saved the strip. He had saved the squadron. But somewhere deep inside, he knew the war would keep demanding men like him, men willing to turn desperation into invention, fear into steel, scrap into salvation, until the final day came. And Tom Redford, fitter of number 274 Squadron, would keep answering that demand, no matter what impossible thing it required him to build next. The men ran. They grabbed a third drum. Tom didn't bother draining it this time. He only pried it open, stuffed a smaller charge inside, and wired the fuse in the simplest, fastest way possible. Raw, ugly design. A metal shell with just enough explosive punch to do damage if it struck. They dragged it to the old Bristol Blenheim, sitting at the edge of the runway, a twin-engine relic grounded for days with intermittent timing issues. Its pilot, Flight Officer James Greeley, was an older man, pushing 40, with eyes that looked permanently tired. He jogged toward them, saw the drum, and said flatly, "You lot have lost your minds." Tom shook his head. "Just borrowing them." The Blenheim sputtered to life with a cough, one engine belching black smoke before finding rhythm. The other groaned, but agreed to behave. The aircraft lumbered forward, straining against age and heat and sand, but it moved. Tom watched as it lifted off, barely clearing the sandbags. Minty was still dancing with death, but the second Stuka had finally boxed him in. The third Stuka dove to assist. Greeley pushed the Blenheim upward, climbing slowly, painfully, like a heavy bird afraid of heights. The two Stukas paid it no attention. They saw it as a broken, slow, useless machine. Tom's heart pounded. He clenched his fists. "Come on! Come on!" The Blenheim reached just enough altitude. Greeley opened the bomb bay. The drum fell, not angled, not tuned, not refined, just raw weight, obeying gravity. It struck the second Stuka square on its canopy. The detonation peeled the cockpit open like a tin lid, Flames spiraled out of the shattered fuselage as the aircraft fell in pieces into the dunes. The last Stuka panicked, breaking formation and fleeing low across the desert. Men on the strip roared. Tom felt his chest heave with breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Minty circled back, triumphant. Greely's Blenheim wobbled home, and Tom, standing in the sunlight, covered in sweat and dust and fuel, felt something strange. Not pride, not relief. Just the dizzying realization that he had become the man everyone was now turning to for salvation. But night was coming. And with night came something far worse than Stukas. The Germans would send Heinkels. The drums would have to change again, and he had only hours to do it.